Do I have to include magic in a fantasy steampunk novel? And how many supernatural elements is needed for it to be fantasy or steampunk? Great questions. Hi, everyone. I'm Beth Barany. I run How to Write the Future podcast. I'm an award-winning science fiction and fantasy novelist, as well as a writing teacher and coach. So thank you so much for this question to my recent poll. So I actually want to talk a little bit about research. Do you read fantasy and steampunk? If you do, then you will notice if there's magic in there and how much and to what extent. Do you have to include magic in a fantasy steampunk novel? I have read a handful of steampunk novels, and the fact that it's called fantasy implies that there's magic, and the magic can be all kinds of ways. So the short answer is yes. The long answer is you get to develop your magic rules, and the magic can be rooted in some kind of steampunk technology if you want. Often in fantasy, magic is connected to artifacts, elements, magical creatures. You get to decide. So the short answer is yes, and read more books in the genre to come up with what is typical and then follow your instincts. If your instincts say, I don't want to include any magic in a fantasy steampunk novel, then you're probably not writing fantasy. You're writing something else, maybe an alternative historical. Steampunk is, let me define steampunk, because a lot of people maybe don't know what that is. So steampunk is a subgenre of science fiction that incorporates retro futuristic technology and aesthetics prominently inspired by 19th century industrial steam-powered machinery and design. Very much kind of like Victorian era meets early 20th century steam engines. Steampunk stories are often set in an alternative history of the Victorian era, or sometimes in the American frontier, where steam power remains in mainstream use. Or maybe it's in a fantasy world that looks similar to Victorian era or the American frontier and employs steam power. So you might have things that are a little bit more modern in culture, but retro in fashion, architecture, and art. Some really great examples of fictional machines could be often are inspired by H.G. Wells and Jules Verne. I've seen stories that have like lighter than air airships, steam cannons, analog computers, mechanical computers, and steampunk also often incorporates other elements. So if you're going to call your story a fantasy, you need magic. If your story is just straight up steampunk, there won't be magic. It'll just be all mechanical, inspired by steam engine. But you can also incorporate horror or historical fiction, or other aspects of speculative fiction to make it any kind of hybrid that you want. A popular subgenre is the Japanese steampunk, which is steampunk-themed manga and anime. So do your research, read widely in the genre, and don't limit yourself to strict rules. Go ahead and create something new. That would be cool. The other question this person asked that I mentioned at the top is, how many supernatural elements is needed for it to be fantasy or steampunk? So don't have an answer for you. I honestly don't know. I say study the genre and do a tally. Count how many magical elements are present in fantasy versus steampunk. There's a wide range, and honestly, all you need to do is make sure your world feels convincing. I say follow your instincts and be very clear about what kind of story you're writing in your own mind. And then after you write the first draft, then go about analyzing it and seeing where it fits. If you're a pantser, if you're someone who wants to write by the seat of your pants, if you're someone who does all this planning ahead of time, then be sure to study deeply the genres. So you can have fantasy steampunk. You can have straight up steampunk. So you get to decide and you get to study what is prevalent and then what is your interest? Where do you want to take your instincts? All right, that's it for this week, everyone. Write long and prosper.